Okay, I just nailed down the design for my first quilt, and I wanted to sort of give a little bit of insight in terms of how it came about because I'm using old long sleeve button down shirts for the quilt fabric, and then I've actually also added a Ralph Lauren comforter that I actually took apart a few years ago. And so I had this interesting fabric, and I love the navy side, but it just seemed to really take away from the sort of mid-tones of the quilt. So I thought it might actually be cool to just use the inside of the fabric that does kind of have that gray sort of look. And then, you know, I could even get little patches out of it in this gray that can kind of go into the pattern. So this was actually one of my last choices. I just sort of figured this part out last night or the night before after I sort of cut out all of these squares. And just to give you a little bit of insight, so I am using literally, you know, shirts, so it's very restrictive. This is so far just the amount of scrap that I have just from cutting out these squares, and I still have a few squares to go. So, you know, like on this one, you could maybe get 3 patches, just to give you an example. So since you're limited, you do have to be very conscious of the pattern that you choose. And I went a few different routes. So I saw on some of the tutorials that I saw, people just very much randomly, you know, put patches together, and they really do seem to look beautiful. For some reason, when I try to do that, it just looks like a jumbled mess. And so I still need to finish cutting a few squares, but my issue was specifically with the sustainable aspect was just, you know, you run out of one denim shirt. And so, you know, you really do have to be creative. For example, here I have a shirt that has a gray inside and a little bit more denim outside. So, you know, for me, in terms of the pattern, the repetition was very important because that's what seems to sort of balance it out, at least for my eye, you know? So when I sort of got to this point without any of the, you know, additional fabric, it did sort of just feel very mid-tone, very cozy, kind of like a child's like blankie. And so I kind of like really wanted to stay here and not throw too many, because again, since they're shirts, I could just go and have a lot of other shirts that, you know, I need to sort of get rid of. So I could have just kept on cutting a bunch of different squares until, you know, I just had sort of a bunch of different squares. Here are all the squares for the other side. But you know, I decided that I'm just gonna do the plaids all in an X, and I tried the X with just the pink, and I tried the X with just the green, and I think that what I like about having them pink and green is that the whole quilt is a little bit more unified. I was originally gonna just do an X in pink and then an X in green and sort of have 2 different X's, but again, I don't know, for me, the way I'm looking at it now, I just feel like this is just very simple, very, again, like it gives me childlike, like I could see myself like watching Muppet Babies, you know, like it's giving me like Raggedy Ann and Andy and things that I'm actually very here for a quilt, because it is my first quilt. I'm expecting to make mistakes in the sewing process. And so, you know, it's not going to be perfect. So I look at it as a quilt that I could just have as like a comfort blanket at home. And so with that being said, this sort of really nice Ralph Lauren fabric is very, very soft. So I'm kind of really excited about having, you know, this as the bottom or the backside, because it's just gonna be a really nice feel. And even though these are sort of like vintage, you know, shirts, and some of them are, you know, plaid and stuff like that and a little bit worn, they are very soft. And you could even see, like, just from putting them, I ironed them before I cut them, obviously, but just playing around with them and having them sort of like this all the time just wrinkled them up again. So I'm gonna have to probably iron them before I continue the process. But I'm really excited, you know, like I have these kind of interest points and it feels very comfy. And so I'm gonna put 2 inches of this fabric around the border, so then I'm gonna have a border edge. And then I'm actually gonna use this side of the blue for the binding, and you could see here the binding from the comforter, which looks really cool. So it will still have, you know, a little tiny bit of this sort of blue fabric at the very end, and it's gonna have these squares that I've incorporated with that fabric. So, you know, within the quilt design, there's gonna be the little pops of the floral, then the floral is gonna kind of, you know, round it out. And then, yeah, I still need to order the batting. I'm just gonna kind of go online and wing it. Unfortunately, we don't have Joann's here, you know, anymore, so I can't really like go in somewhere and feel things out. So I'm a little bit nervous about that, but I'm basically just gonna finish this design. I'm gonna add 2 more rows so that I have a complete cross here, which, you know, I think that's going to be a nice repetitive aspect to have this cross finished and then have 1 more row so that I have the plaid X's that come together, and then I have these, you know, crosses with the floral. I think that that's going to be a good size. I think it's going to end up being either 50 or 60 inches wide, and, you know, so it's still going to be sort of where I was gonna end up. At first I was gonna do a 50 by 60. It's gonna be a little bit different in terms of, you know, I think I'm gonna have like 9 or 10, I don't know. But, you know, I'm kind of winging it. And I think that that's the important thing that I've learned with the sustainable materials. It's that you have to, I've had to do this sort of setup a few different times to nail down the design. Just because, again, the limited materials, the having to sort of figure out where you can put stuff in to get, you know, more squares, like whether you can use these squares, all of that stuff for me took about 2 or 3 different sort of setups to get it right. So I'm still, you know, I'm gonna add 2 rows to each side here, and then I'm gonna add another square sort of onto this side. So, you know, I'm more than halfway there in the sense that I have a lot of these squares already cut, but again, I haven't done the final count on everything. I have to put this on the floor to be able to set it up completely, but my dog just freaking runs all over it. So you can see that's why a lot of them are wrinkled. So, you know, I need to sort of get Oliver a little bit under control and then just really set it up and see what I need. And then I'm gonna sort of start the actual, sewing process, which again, I'm kind of nervous already, even with like the tension. I do have the walking foot, which is good. So, you know, I know that for the quilting part, I'm not going to need necessarily anything new. I know I have a new package of needles, but yeah, I mean, I'm kind of excited. I think that seeing your design and like being able to visualize it, I've taken photos, and I wanted to do this video specifically with, you know, this, square, because this square is how I figured out my design. It's not the whole thing, but it just got me to a point to where I was like, oh, okay, this, with just a couple more here, you know, 6 more there, and then I have a quilt. And so, you know, I'm really excited about that. And I will say the one thing I am, again, like kind of nervous about mainly is just the binding. So if anybody has any quilt binding tips, you know, tricks, I saw one video that I'll link in the description that I thought did a really good job of the whole quilting process. So I'm using that tutorial right now, but I'm gonna look up a few more because, again, like the binding process, I ideally not want to bind it by hand at the end. I'm not necessarily against it. I'm not a good hand sewer. So that's kind of the one thing that has me a little nervous, but honestly, by the time I get to that point, I will be a better sewer just because I will have sewn all of these together. I would have sewn that together. So that's kind of what my biggest takeaway about this process is, that I'm just learning so much. I'm getting back into sewing with, you know, sort of like soft materials, and that I'm kind of like really liking as like a cozy way to, you know, enjoy the fall and get into the winter.